Have you ever wondered why a man who swore he needed space, who acted like detachment was his superpower, who convinced himself that emotions were weaknesses, still can't forget you? He walked away, he chose distance, he told himself it wasn't that deep, and yet months later, in quiet moments, when distractions fade and pride softens, your memory creeps back in like a song he can't turn off. This isn't about ego. It isn't about unfinished business. It isn't even about love in the way most people understand it. It's about the emotional scar. It's about what happens when an avoidant man meets the one woman who did something different, something that reached past his defenses and touched the part of him he spent a lifetime protecting. You didn't just date him, you disrupted him. And that disruption is what he cannot forget. The first thing you did without even realizing it was see through him. Most people only meet the surface of an avoidant man. They see the charm, the independence, the easygoing nature, the cool detachment. They don't question it. They don't look deeper. But you did. You noticed the hesitation behind his confidence. You sensed the tension in his silence. You felt the way he would pull back right when things started to feel real. And instead of accusing him, instead of demanding he change, you simply understood. You saw the little boy behind the armor. You recognized the fear beneath the calm. That kind of emotional awareness is rare, and it shook him. Avoidant men survive by controlling perception. As long as no one sees the cracks, they can pretend they're unbreakable. But you noticed the cracks without trying to pry them open. You didn't expose him publicly. You didn't shame him. You simply saw him, and being seen like that is both intoxicating and terrifying. Because once someone truly sees you, you can't hide from yourself anymore. He may have acted unaffected. He may have brushed things off. But deep down, he knows you saw parts of him he doesn't even want to acknowledge. That realization leaves a mark, not because it hurt him, but because it made him feel vulnerable in a way he couldn't control. And vulnerability, for him, feels like danger. So he stepped back. But stepping back doesn't erase the memory of being understood. The second thing you did was something most people fail to do. When he pulled away, you didn't chase. You didn't beg for reassurance. You didn't flood his phone with paragraphs asking what went wrong. You felt the shift? Yes. You were confused? Yes. But instead of panicking, you leaned back. You gave him space without turning it into a war. That single decision disrupted his entire internal script. Avoidant men are used to one pattern. They pull away and the other person clings tighter. That confirms their belief that closeness equals pressure, that love equals suffocation. But you didn't suffocate him. You didn't collapse. You responded with quiet strength, and that strength unsettled him. Because when you don't chase, he loses the illusion of control. When you don't beg, he can't convince himself you were desperate. When you stand still instead of running after him, he's forced to confront his own movement away from something stable. He may have told himself you didn't care. He may have tried to interpret your calm as indifference, but deep down, your restraint created a loop in his mind. He wonders why you didn't react the way others did. He replays conversations. He questions whether he misjudged you. And the more he replays it, the deeper the imprint becomes. Your self-respect became the emotional scar. Not because it wounded him, but because it exposed his pattern without you ever having to say a word. The third thing you did was even more powerful. You loved him without trying to fix him. Many partners sense the emotional distance in an avoidant man and immediately go into repair mode. They try to analyze him, diagnose him, reshape him into something safer. But you didn't treat him like a project. You didn't sit across from him with a silent checklist of improvements. You accepted what he showed you in the present moment. You appreciated his strengths. You laughed with him. You allowed the connection to unfold naturally. That kind of love feels foreign to someone who grew up associating closeness with criticism or emotional demand. When someone loves you without trying to control you, it creates peace. But peace is unfamiliar territory for someone wired for self-protection. An unfamiliar peace can feel like a trap. He may not have consciously understood why he started pulling away just when things felt good. But inside, something was stirring. Healthy love challenged his survival strategy. It made him question the walls he built, and questioning those walls feels destabilizing. So instead of leaning in, he leaned out. Yet even after leaving, he can't fully detach from the memory of how it felt to be accepted without pressure. Every new connection is subconsciously compared to that experience. Every new interaction is measured against the safety you offered. And when he doesn't find that same quiet acceptance, the contrast brings you back into his thoughts. That's the scar. not dramatic pain, not chaos, but the memory of a love that didn't try to cage him. The fourth thing you did, the thing that sealed the imprint, was walk away with dignity when you realized the imbalance. You didn't stay and beg for crumbs. You didn't twist yourself into a smaller version just to keep him comfortable. You recognized when your emotional needs weren't being met, and instead of fighting him to become someone he wasn't ready to be, you chose yourself. That decision created a fracture in his internal narrative. Avoidant men often convince themselves that if someone leaves, it's because that person was too emotional, too demanding, too unstable. But you didn't leave in chaos. You left calmly. You left clearly. You left without trying to punish him. And that forces him to confront a harder truth. Maybe the loss wasn't about your instability. Maybe it was about his inability to stay. That realization is heavy because it removes the protective story he tells himself. Now, when he thinks of you, he doesn't just remember moments of connection. He remembers the version of himself that couldn't step up. He remembers the opportunity for something secure that slipped through his hands. And that's where the emotional scar truly forms. It's not about missing your presence alone. It's about confronting the part of himself that wasn't ready for what you offered. You represented growth. You represented emotional depth. You represented a kind of intimacy that required courage. And when he chose retreat over courage, he may have gained temporary relief, but he lost something that felt rare. That loss lingers. It surfaces in quiet nights. It whispers during lonely mornings. It appears when another woman tries to connect, and he feels the difference. He may never admit it openly. He may never send the message he drafts in his mind, but the truth remains. Avoidant men don't forget the woman who made them feel seen, who didn't chase their withdrawal, who loved without trying to fix them, and who walked away with dignity. They don't forget her because she didn't attack their defenses. She simply exposed them by being emotionally steady. And emotional steadiness is the one thing they secretly crave but fear the most. That contradiction becomes the scar. Not a wound that bleeds loudly, but one that quietly aches whenever he remembers what he once had and what he wasn't ready to hold. And the ache doesn't fade the way he expected it to, because the fifth thing you did was challenge him emotionally without attacking him. You didn't stay on the surface. You didn't keep conversations light, just to avoid discomfort. You asked real questions. You invited depth. You wanted to understand what shaped him, what hurt him, what made him shut down. Not in an interrogating way, not in a way that felt like pressure, but in a way that said, I want to know you beyond the mask. For someone who survives by staying emotionally self-contained, that invitation is destabilizing. Depth requires honesty. Honesty requires vulnerability. And vulnerability feels like standing unarmed in a battlefield he's spent years avoiding. When you asked him what he was feeling and actually waited for the answer, it forced him to look inward instead of outward. When you gently pointed out patterns without shaming him, it disrupted the autopilot he lives on. You weren't trying to corner him, you were trying to connect. But connection, real connection, means he can't hide behind sarcasm or independence. And now that you're gone, he misses those conversations more than he admits. He misses being challenged in a way that wasn't hostile. He misses the way you stretched him without humiliating him. Because growth is uncomfortable in the moment, but unforgettable in hindsight. And you became the symbol of the growth he wasn't ready to embrace. The sixth thing you did was refuse to accept breadcrumbs. You didn't settle for half texts at midnight. You didn't romanticize inconsistency. When he gave you pieces instead of presents, you noticed. When he withdrew affection and then returned like nothing happened, you felt the imbalance. And instead of convincing yourself that this was just how love works, you held your standards quietly. You didn't scream about it. You didn't threaten him. You simply didn't overextend to compensate for what he lacked. That refusal creates a powerful shift in an avoidant man's mind. He is used to people tolerating the bare minimum because his charm and emotional mystery are intoxicating at first. But you didn't get drunk on potential. You paid attention to reality, and when reality didn't align with what you needed, you slowly detached. That slow detachment is what he didn't expect. He thought he controlled the distance. He thought he decided when closeness happened and when it paused. But when you emotionally leaned back without chaos, he felt the shift. And that shift created anxiety he doesn't know how to process. Because for the first time, he wasn't the only one with the power to withdraw. You showed him that love is mutual or it is nothing. And now, when he looks back, he doesn't just remember your warmth. He remembers the moment he realized he couldn't keep you with half effort. That realization stings, not because you hurt him, but because you required more than he was prepared to give. The seventh thing you did was something even deeper. You didn't shame his avoidance. You didn't label him cold. You didn't mock his need for space. You recognized it as a defense instead of a personality flaw. And that level of emotional intelligence disarms someone who expects attack. He may have braced himself for criticism. He may have anticipated accusations. But instead, you responded with calm awareness. When he shut down, you didn't explode. When he needed distance, you didn't chase him with blame. You might have expressed hurt, but you didn't weaponize it. That kind of maturity lingers in a man's memory because most people respond to avoidance with more intensity, and intensity confirms his belief that closeness equals chaos. But you didn't bring chaos. You brought steadiness, and steadiness is unfamiliar. It feels almost suspicious to someone used to emotional volatility. He may have even tested it, pulling away a little further just to see if you would finally snap. But you didn't play the role he subconsciously expected, and now that you're gone, he realizes how rare that was. He realizes that not everyone will handle his distance with patience. Not everyone will respond with understanding instead of ego. And that awareness creates longing, because losing someone emotionally intelligent doesn't just feel like heartbreak. It feels like losing safety. The eighth thing you did was reflect his potential back to him. You saw who he could be beyond his fear. You acknowledged his strengths. You spoke to the parts of him that were capable of depth, loyalty, and stability. And when someone reflects your highest self back to you, it creates a powerful bond. But it also creates pressure, because now he can't pretend he doesn't know what he's capable of. You saw his emotional intelligence even when he tried to hide it. You noticed the softness in him when he let his guard down for a second too long. You believed in a version of him that required courage. And believing in someone can feel like both a gift and a burden, because now he has to choose whether to rise to that vision or retreat into comfort. At the time, retreat felt safer. At the time, minimizing the connection felt easier than stepping into emotional responsibility. But after distance settles in, the mirror you held up doesn't disappear. He remembers the way you looked at him when he was vulnerable. He remembers feeling capable of more, and that memory becomes heavy, because it confronts him with the gap between who he is and who he could have been with you. That gap is painful, and pain, when unresolved, turns into an emotional scar. And finally, the ninth thing you did was not collapse after the breakup. You felt the hurt, yes. You had nights where silence felt loud and memories felt suffocating, but you didn't chase him for closure that he wasn't prepared to give. You didn't try to convince him to come back by proving your worth. You chose to heal. You chose to pour energy back into yourself, and whether he admits it or not, he noticed. Avoidant men often assume that once they step away, the other person will remain emotionally tethered, waiting. But when you began rebuilding, when you stopped orbiting around his absence, something shifted in him. He expected to be the one who detached. He didn't expect you to detach too. And when he senses that you're no longer emotionally available in the same way, reality hits differently. Because now the loss feels real. Now the door he assumed would stay slightly open begins to close. And nothing activates suppressed attachment like finality. In the quiet, he replays moments. He remembers your laughter. He remembers the safety. He remembers the conversations that pushed him gently toward depth. And he feels the weight of what he let go, not because you begged him to see it, but because you stopped trying to make him see it. That's the emotional scar. It isn't loud regret. It isn't dramatic confession. It's the quiet realization that the woman who did all of this, who saw him, respected herself, loved without control, challenged him gently, refused breadcrumbs, showed emotional intelligence, reflected his potential, and walked away with dignity, cannot be easily replaced. And the hardest part for him is this: you didn't leave damage. You left clarity. You showed him what secure connection looks like. You showed him what mature love feels like. And once someone experiences that, even briefly, they can never fully convince themselves they don't want it. So he carries the memory, he carries the contrast, he carries the awareness of what was possible, and whether pride keeps him silent or fear keeps him distant, the imprint remains. Avoidant men may run from intensity, they may escape from vulnerability, but they do not forget the woman who awakened emotions. They spent a lifetime suppressing, because she didn't just touch his heart, she confronted his defenses. And that confrontation, gentle but undeniable, becomes the scar he feels long after you're gone. And that imprint doesn't just sit quietly in the background of his mind. It follows him into new connections. That's the 10th thing you did. Without even trying, you became the standard he silently compares everyone to. He may start dating again. He may distract himself with attention, with work, with temporary excitement. On the surface, it can look like he has moved on effortlessly. But what no one sees are the invisible comparisons happening in real time. When another woman reacts dramatically to his need for space, he remembers how you responded with calm. When someone demands reassurance every hour, he remembers how you trusted him until trust was broken. When conversations stay shallow and safe, he remembers how you invited him into depth without judgment. And that contrast lingers. It creates a quiet dissatisfaction he doesn't fully understand. He might even find himself irritated without knowing why. It's not because the new person is doing something wrong. It's because he experienced something rare with you. Stability without control, warmth without pressure, strength without aggression. And once someone tastes that kind of connection, even briefly, ordinary dynamics feel incomplete. This is the part no one talks about. Avoidant men don't always miss the person loudly. They miss the feeling, they miss the emotional atmosphere, they miss who they were allowed to be in your presence. And because that feeling was tied to you, your absence becomes more noticeable over time, not less. The 11th thing you did was awaken his fear of real loss. Avoidant attachment operates on delayed emotion. While you were present, while the relationship was unfolding, his focus was on maintaining control, maintaining distance, maintaining internal safety. He suppressed attachment because attachment feels threatening. But once you stepped away completely, not halfway, not with one foot still in the door, something shifted. Finality activates what presence suppresses. When he realized you were no longer emotionally available in the same way that he couldn't simply return whenever it was comfortable for him, the emotional reality began to surface. Loss is different when it's real. It's different when your messages stop, when your energy is no longer directed toward him, when he senses that you are rebuilding without him. That's when attachment, the very thing he avoided feeling, starts rising to the surface, and it confuses him. Because now he feels the weight of something he convinced himself he didn't need. He might tell himself it's just nostalgia. He might minimize it as ego. But deep down, it's grief. Grief for a connection that required courage he didn't yet have. Grief for the version of himself that almost stepped forward but retreated instead. And grief, when it's tied to self-awareness, becomes a scar that doesn't easily fade. The 12th thing you did was show him secure love without announcing it. You didn't lecture him about attachment styles. You didn't position yourself as superior. You simply embodied emotional security. You communicated your needs clearly. You respected his space without abandoning yourself. You expressed affection without clinging. You held boundaries without hostility. That balance is powerful because secure energy doesn't beg and it doesn't chase. It stands firm. For someone wired for avoidance, secure love feels calm, and calm can feel unfamiliar. He may have mistaken that calm for lack of intensity at first. Avoidants are often accustomed to dynamics filled with anxiety and drama. Chaos feels like chemistry because it mirrors internal tension, but what you offered was different. It was steady. It was grounded. It didn't spike his adrenaline. It invited him into peace, and peace requires vulnerability. Peace requires lowering defenses. He may not have had the emotional tools to stay in that environment, but that doesn't mean he didn't feel its value. Now, when he reflects on the relationship, he realizes something important. You weren't asking for too much. You were asking for mutual effort. You weren't overwhelming him. You were offering stability, and stability is rare. The recognition of that rarity is what lingers long after pride fades. Because deep down, he knows that finding someone emotionally secure who also cared deeply isn't easy, and losing that isn't light. The 13th thing you did was disrupt his identity. Avoidant men often see themselves as independent, self-sufficient, emotionally controlled. They take pride in not needing anyone, but with you, something cracked in that identity. He needed your presence more than he expected. He looked forward to your messages. He felt grounded in your company. He may never have said it out loud, but your absence felt heavier than he predicted. And that realization challenges his self-concept. Because if he admits that he felt deeply attached, then he has to confront the fact that he is not as detached as he pretends. That confrontation is uncomfortable. It shakes the narrative he built to survive earlier emotional wounds. Instead of being the one who always leaves unaffected, he becomes the one who lost something meaningful. And that role reversal is humbling. It forces growth or denial. Some avoidant men double down on detachment to protect their ego. Others slowly begin to question their patterns. But regardless of which path he chooses, the disruption remains. You altered the way he sees himself. You showed him he is capable of emotional depth. And once someone realizes they are capable of more than they allowed themselves to feel, they cannot fully return to ignorance. That awareness becomes permanent. And the 14th thing, the final layer of the emotional scar is this. You made him feel without drama, without chaos, without manipulation. You made him feel in a way that was quiet and real. There were moments when he laughed freely with you, moments when his guard slipped and he shared something personal, moments when the future didn't feel threatening but possible. Those moments may have been brief, but they were authentic, and authenticity is powerful. It doesn't fade easily. He may try to convince himself that walking away was logical. He may justify it as timing, incompatibility, or needing space. But emotions don't disappear just because they are inconvenient. They settle, they wait, they resurface in stillness, and when they do, he remembers. He remembers the safety. He remembers the challenge. He remembers the dignity with which you carried yourself. He remembers that you did not try to own him. You simply offered connection. And now he understands something he couldn't grasp before. The woman who did this, who loved with strength, who walked away with grace, who refused to shrink, who awakened depth without demanding it, doesn't leave chaos behind. She leaves clarity. She leaves awareness. She leaves a mirror that reflects both what he experienced and what he avoided. And that mirror becomes the emotional scar, not because it destroyed him, but because it revealed him. And being revealed truly and gently is something an avoidant man never forgets. So if you are listening to this and wondering why he still circles back in small ways, why his energy feels unfinished, why you sense that you left a mark, understand this. It wasn't about perfection. It wasn't about playing a role. It was about authenticity meeting avoidance. It was about secure love brushing against fear. And when fear retreats from something real, it doesn't erase it, it remembers it. That is why he can't forget you. Not because you chased, not because you begged, but because you stood steady. And steady love, once experienced, becomes the standard the heart quietly longs to return to, even if pride never allows the words to be spoken. And even if he never says it out loud, there is a 15th truth, sitting quietly beneath everything. You became the emotional reference point he didn't ask for but cannot erase. Time moves forward. Life gets busy. Conversations change. Faces change. Environments change. But reference points stay. When something reminds him of you, a certain kind of calm voice, a way of listening without interrupting, the feeling of being understood without having to explain every detail, his nervous system reacts before his ego does. He may not consciously think, I miss her. Instead, he feels a subtle tightness in his chest, a flicker of memory, a moment of comparison, and that is the scar. Emotional scars are not always dramatic. Sometimes they are quiet sensations that surface unexpectedly. You became associated with emotional safety and emotional exposure at the same time. That paradox imprinted deeply, because for him, safety and vulnerability rarely coexist. But with you, they did. And once someone experiences safety and vulnerability together, even briefly, it rewires something. He may resist it, he may deny it, but he cannot unexperience it. The 16th thing that lingers is the way you handled silence. Silence is an avoidant man's comfort zone. It's where he regains control. It's where he avoids confrontation. It's where he hides emotions he doesn't want to process. But you didn't treat silence as abandonment. You didn't automatically assume the worst. At the same time, you didn't tolerate endless emotional distance. You responded thoughtfully. You gave space, but you also had limits. That balance confused him at first, because he expected one extreme or the other, either someone who panics at silence or someone who disappears completely. But you stayed emotionally present without chasing, and that presence created accountability without aggression. When you eventually stepped back for good, the silence changed. It was no longer his tool. It was no longer his shield. It became real absence. And real absence feels different than controlled distance. In controlled distance, he believes he can return whenever he chooses. In real absence, he feels the door closing. That shift is powerful because now silence doesn't feel like safety, it feels like loss. And loss is something avoidant men don't process quickly. It lingers beneath the surface, surfacing in unexpected ways: irritability, restlessness, sudden nostalgia. But underneath it all is one truth: the silence without you feels heavier than the silence he once used to protect himself. The 17th layer of this emotional scar is how you handled your own emotions. You were not emotionless. You were not detached. You felt deeply. You cared deeply. And when something hurt you, you expressed it. But you didn't weaponize your pain. You didn't use tears as leverage. You didn't turn vulnerability into manipulation. That kind of emotional responsibility is rare, and it challenges someone who is used to emotional chaos equaling connection. You showed him that strong emotions can exist without drama, that disappointment can be expressed without humiliation, that boundaries can be set without destruction. This forced him to confront something uncomfortable. His fear of emotion may not be about emotions themselves. It may be about how he learned to associate them with instability. But you weren't unstable. You were grounded. And grounded emotion is harder to dismiss. He couldn't label you as irrational to justify distancing himself. He couldn't blame your reactions for his withdrawal, which means deep down, he knows the distance wasn't caused by your intensity. It was caused by his fear. That awareness sits quietly in his mind, and even if he never fully admits it, it reshapes how he sees the entire connection. The 18th thing that makes you unforgettable is that you didn't compete for his attention. You didn't try to outshine other women. You didn't beg to be chosen. You simply existed in your own value. You had your own world, your own interests, your own growth. You wanted him, but you did not orbit around him. That independence did something unexpected. It attracted him deeply, but it also unsettled him, because independence means you can leave. Independence means you are not emotionally trapped. And when you finally did step away, you didn't collapse into bitterness. You redirected your energy inward. That quiet strength leaves a lasting imprint. He may have expected you to fight harder for him. He may have expected emotional chaos at the end, but instead you chose yourself with grace. And grace is powerful. It removes the narrative that you were too much. It removes the excuse that you were unstable. What remains is clarity. You were stable, you were strong, and you were willing to walk away when reciprocity was missing. That forces him to confront his role. And confronting one's role in losing something meaningful is not easy. It sits heavy in the chest. It echoes in moments of solitude. And the 19th and final truth that completes this emotional scar is this: you awakened longing without desperation. Longing is dangerous for an avoidant man. It threatens his sense of control. But with you, longing appeared quietly. It wasn't built on obsession. It wasn't built on intensity alone. It was built on emotional depth, safety, respect, and authenticity. When you left, you didn't just remove your presence, you removed the possibility of what could have been. And possibility is powerful. He doesn't just miss what was, he wonders about what might have been if he had leaned in instead of pulling away, if he had chosen courage instead of comfort, if he had allowed himself to stay in vulnerability instead of escaping it. Those what-if questions create a loop that is hard to silence because they aren't about fantasy. They are about missed growth, and missed growth lingers. It becomes a lesson. It becomes awareness. It becomes an internal shift that may not show immediately, but slowly reshapes him. So when we talk about the emotional scar, understand this clearly. It is not about revenge. It is not about making him suffer. It is about impact. You impacted him because you represented something emotionally real. You were not perfect. You were not flawless, but you were authentic. And authenticity reaches places manipulation never can. That is why he can't forget you, because forgetting you would require forgetting the part of himself that felt deeply in your presence. It would require erasing the mirror you held up. And people can run from mirrors, but they rarely forget what they saw in them. So if you are listening and wondering whether you mattered, you did. If you are questioning whether your steady love left a mark, it did. Avoidant men may hide emotion, they may suppress attachment, they may take longer to process loss, but they do not walk away untouched from the woman who awakened their heart without trying to own it. That kind of connection doesn't disappear. It settles into memory. It becomes contrast. It becomes awareness. And sometimes, long after pride fades and fear softens, it becomes the very lesson that changes them.